I'm Mr. MegaManFan. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. You know all the things to do. Today I got 2 packages delivered from a delivery service I've never heard of before buying this, called Uni Uni. If you have any experience with them, please let me know in the comments below. This was my first experience with them, and Buddy was very curious about where these packages came from. Well, they came from California, and then Texas, and then Chicago, because Uni Uni tracked them to distribution warehouses all across the country before they finally got to me 11 days later. Now, you've already seen Buck Bunny and the Cursed Cartridge, but what's in the bigger box? Well, it's the ModRetro Chromatic. There is another player in the retro Game Boy field, and by the retro Game Boy field, I mean new devices that aim to play old Game Boy games with as authentic and as accurate as possible of a display and resolution and gameplay experience as the original Game Boy, but with more modern options. The other player in this field that has really made waves is the Analog Pocket, but this comes in a little cheaper than the Pocket does, and it offers some things that the Analog Pocket doesn't, and we're going to talk about that in today's video. But the first thing we have to do is get the ModRetro Chromatic out of the box and take a look at everything that's inside. So, gotta figure out which seam I want to open this with. That's always the first choice, is where do I break it open so that I don't mar up the box, because I'm just happy this box actually got to me in good condition, unlike the Analog 3D box, so I'm going to aim to keep it in that same condition. And there you see I've managed to get the shrink wrap off of it and pull it away, and Buddy is no longer interested in sniffing everything, so he too has gone away. Like so many of the retro re-released Game Boy games that I buy lately, this one has a magnetic hinge on the side of the box, so you don't have to crease the top flap with your fingers, you don't have to push a tray up from beneath, you just unfold the magnet and everything is right there in front of you, including the ModRetro Chromatic itself, which was a little difficult to get out of its tray, and the whole tray ended up coming up with it, but that revealed the Chromatic Tetris and the included 3 AA batteries. But the point of this review today is to answer a question. And I want to know if this is a good modern Game Boy. And without using one myself, there's no way I can tell that. What I can't say so far is, from unboxing it, I like the presentation of it. I like the fact that it comes with a pack-in game, just like the Game Boy did back in the day, and it's Tetris, which is also very familiar to me, and they even threw in batteries, which I'm pretty sure Nintendo didn't do on Game Boy, and it also took 4 AA batteries if you had the original Game Boy like I did. This only takes 3. Now, the packaging tells you to scan a QR code and download the latest firmware updater for your Mac or PC, then turn on the device, plug in USB to both ends, your computer and the ModRetro Chromatic, then install any new firmware if available, and in my case new firmware was available, and the screen on my Chromatic went black while it was being installed. I thought it would stay black, but halfway through the update process the screen came back on again, which caught me a little bit off guard. I actually started to worry that maybe I should have done this on a Windows PC instead of a MacBook, but as it turned out, this was just a normal part of the process that they didn't describe in the firmware update software. So no need to worry if your screen comes back on while you're doing this. If you're a person who buys a ModRetro Chromatic, it will go off and come back on. That's perfectly normal. And once it's done updating, it tells you to power off the device, take the batteries out of the system, then put the batteries back in and start playing. I'm going to assume that removing the batteries forces it to power cycle in some internal way that just flipping the on-off switch doesn't do. Once all those things were done, I took my chromatic Tetris, put it into the ModRetro Chromatic, and voila, we have game. The button on the side controls the system menu where you can adjust the brightness, pick a different color palette, choose which kind of display options you want, or even set it into streaming mode where if you connect it via USB-C to a Mac or a PC, you can output the same display you're seeing on your screen to your computer screen and use it for streaming purposes, which I can see coming in very handy. And you have to give them this much if you give them nothing else. That's a feature the Analog Pocket does not have. I mean, you can plug the Analog Pocket into a dock and capture that via HDMI out if you want to, but you have to buy a dock separately, which isn't a cheap thing to buy, and you have to pay for shipping, which with analog is never cheap. Shipping was free on this, and they actually had a Black Friday holiday sale, so I got this device with a discount on top of that. That's part of what tipped me over the edge to actually wanting to buy it for a review, was the discount and the free shipping. I also want to put this through its paces by trying an EverDrive GBX7. If it's fully compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games as claimed, then the EverDrive should work, and lo and behold, it does. Now we'll go into the menus here and we'll look at some of the games that I have loaded onto it and see how they perform. I always like to start when I test a new device like this with Mega Man games, so we're going right to Mega Man Extreme for Game Boy Color. And as you can see, it is starting up and playing just as it should. By the way, the first time you turn this thing on, it's going to be really loud and really bright. I actually have turned it down quite a bit from where I started from because this thing is a powerhouse. If you had a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color back in the day, you remember how dim those screens were and having to use all sorts of contraptions plugged into the side of them or snapped over the top of them, or maybe you had a desk lamp you would point at the screen to make it visible. It was not good. Nintendo did that as a way to save on battery life and to keep the costs down as opposed to having a screen that was front lit or backlit. But eventually, in the Game Boy Advance generation, that was no longer going to fly. And they released a Game Boy Advance SP that actually had a lit screen. Not as powerful as the screens we have today, but it was such a huge improvement that I still adore my GBA SP even now, after all these years, just because I have such fond memories of finally having a screen I could see without having to point a light source at it. So I will give ModRetro more credit where credit's due, although they don't get more credit than Analog Pocket because it does the same thing. It has a pixel-perfect display in the same shape and size as the original Game Boy. At this point, we can definitely draw the line between what one can do and what the other can't do, because here we have a device that is only meant to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. They made that their niche, and they're sticking to it. There are no FPGA cores, and there is no Game Boy Advance support. So if you're looking for a system that can play all of your portable games, and even some more using adapters for Game Gear and TurboGrafx and the like, the ModRetro Chromatic will not be for you. If you want all of those things, you can buy an Analog Pocket if they're available, which they may or may not be at the time you watch this, and if you want to pay for the adapters to play the other games, which may or may not be available at the time you're watching this, and you're going to pay a premium price, anywhere from $50 to $100 more than you're going to pay for a ModRetro Chromatic. So if you're buying a device just to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, maybe you don't need the Analog Pocket if you're not going to play Game Boy Advance games or Sega Game Gear games or use FPGA cores to play other games that you load onto your system through an SD card. If you just want to play Game Boy games, this is a acceptable way to do it. In fact, I would say in some respects more than acceptable. I actually like the D-pad a little better on this. The Analog Pocket D-pad kind of feels mushy sometimes when I push a direction on a game like Mr. Do. I don't feel like I turn in time or I turn before I wanted to turn. The controls on this feel tight, maybe even a little stiff, but I'm actually a proponent of that. I would like a control that I press firmly and know that I pressed it in the right direction as opposed to one that kind of wiggles around over its center pivot and doesn't feel like you're really fully in control at all times. So your mileage may vary on that. I don't consider the Analog Pocket unplayable, but I do feel like I have tighter controls when it's docked and I use a third-party control instead of the D-pad on the device, where I don't feel that way with the Chromatic. I feel like the D-pad on here is good enough that I can use it without having to resort to third-party controllers and a dock. So let's give them a point in their favor for that. I also bought a game to bundle with it because I didn't want Chromatic Tetris to be the only game that I played. So I bought Buck Bunny and the Cursed Cartridge just because I found this a hilarious idea, an amusing mascot because he's trying so hard to be foul-mouthed and obscene and rude that it actually is patently obvious that this is a corporation trying to paint over what they are with something that their audience will find relatable. It's like paying the Happy Tree Friends to be your mascot. It's fine. It's funny to me. It's dumb in a dumb way that I find amusing. And sometimes that's good enough. If you're looking for something less expensive than a Pocket that can only play Game Boy and Game Boy Color and play those games really well, I've got news for you. It can do those things, and it will cost you less than the base price of a Pocket, let alone shipping, let alone having to pay for a scalper if they aren't currently available. And the ModRetro Chromatic, they're in stock, they are available, and they're not hard to get.